All right, welcome to Cwic Show and our next episode in the Critical Theories series. Here it is again, right? We keep talking about what is going to be showing up in the church, at BYU, etc. Here we have it again. An article written about a week ago in Public Square magazine, a great place to go, by the way, to find some excellent articles. Written by a Ronald Schodel. I apologize if I'm not getting that name right. Is just the next example of what is so concerning in the church, right? This is probably the worst I've seen yet of an adult conflating critical race theory with the gospel. Here's the headline of his article: How Critical Race Theory Helps Us Follow Jesus. This is coming. Right? This is coming, and you're going to hear this left and right. You're going to hear it in your Sunday school, Elders Quorum, Relief Society. The kids are going to hear it in their youth classes. This is coming. And it's very concerning. I want to go through this and parse this article out a little bit, do a little bit of a review on it. By doing so, I think you're going to get a clear understanding of where people are going to be coming from, like Mr. Schodel here, in trying to support critical race theory as part of the gospel, because that's exactly what he does here. He equates the two. This is the same exact thing that happened in the early and mid 20th century with communism. It's the same thing. You had members of the church that were saying, hey, we're helping out the poor. Aren't we taught throughout the scriptures to help out the poor? And then there's the United Order and the law of consecration. So this goes right along with the gospel, right? This is exactly the same type of thinking within a very similar, slightly evolved ideology that moved from raw Marxism into now what we see as critical race theory. And that's the important thing to understand. Here's your daily reminder, if you will, that critical race theory comes from Marxist roots. That's where it is. That's what it is overall. It is about conflict theory. It's about the oppressors and the oppressed and the victims. That's what it's all about, and that's how it operates. Its tenets are based on Marxist roots, not on the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's very, very different. The name critical race theory is Marxist. You might as well call it a raw Marxism. Originally, you could call it critical class theory. Very similar in what's going on here. Critical comes from Marx. That term comes from critiquing, right? That goes back to Kant, actually, but it's really founded in Marx and Marxism, the idea of critical. From there, it went to the Frankfurt School, where they produced what is called critical theory. It was a number of Marxists that got together that what they tried to do is figure out why the Marxist revolution, the communist revolution, was not working throughout the globe, especially in the West. Why wasn't this working? So that was what they focused on. They moved their school from Frankfurt here to the United States. And then living in the United States began to try and form a cultural type of approach to Marxism instead of an economic and class-oriented approach. They saw that this wouldn't work. In their own words, they say that capitalism, that liberal democracy, works too well for the blue-collar worker, for the laborers. It works too well for them. So since that doesn't work, and we're not going to be able to bring about the Marxist revolution here, we need to figure out a different way to have this enter into society. And so they started working on critical theory, which moved it from not just a class-based ideology of Marxism, but moved it into the culture. That's critical theory. And from critical theory, you then move to several different disciplines. One of those is critical legal theory or critical legal studies. And out of that comes critical race theory. It is the child or grandchild of critical theory. It's Marxist. It's Marxist in its roots. And don't let anybody tell you differently. Yes, it evolved some. It has evolved. But it's the same thing. Now, this article is either an intended or an unintended plea for a secular authoritarianism in the church. That's what it is. But here's how he starts this out. He says, amidst all the pushback of CRT of late, I fear disciples of Christ may be missing some of the ways this framework or analysis might help us follow the Savior in healing the world. All right, so he's conflating it. He's bringing it together. Now, you might as well say in the 20th century, early to mid-20th century, amidst all the pushback of communism of late, of Marxism of late, I fear disciples of Christ may be missing some of the ways this framework for analysis might help us follow the Savior in healing the world. Right? It's almost the same thing. And he starts off here with something interesting about being colorblind, that he learned to be colorblind, and this is a wrong thing for him now. So we want to look at a distinction here going back into about the 60s, which is really important. There were two movements. There was the civil rights movement, and there was a radical leftist movement that we saw through the 60s on the campuses especially, same place as we get it now. That was very different, right? And when it involved race, it had to do with things like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. Right? These were black power movements that were black supremacist movements that fought against what Martin Luther King was fighting for. It was a different brand of solution. And Martin Luther King's I have a dream that my children and your children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? That's colorblindness. And this fights very much against that. CRT wants to focus on race. That's what needs to be understood. It wants constantly to filter everything, every conversation, every event, everything is filtered through a racial lens. So colorblindness is not going to work with that. The other thing to understand with this is that colorblindness means liberal democracy. All men are created equal. Now, we haven't done a very good job of that in the West in the past. We're doing a much better job now, despite what those who push CRT will tell you. Still a ways to go, of course. But colorblindness is a code, in some ways, for liberal democracy. Now, having said that, I want to make a distinction here. This is nuanced. Colorblindness is important in terms of applying universal principles. Critical race theorists will try and take that away as much as possible. They don't like that at all. They don't want liberal democracy. In the end, that's what this is all really about. Destroying the West, taking down liberal democracy. Race is just the vehicle right now. But that doesn't mean that we don't notice the difference in our backgrounds and in our own personal experiences. That's important. We would want to do that. When I went to Mexico on my mission, I wanted to learn more about their background. I wanted to see them as Mexicans, as Latinos. I wanted to see what their experience is, and I wanted to immerse myself into that as much as I could. In that sense, you don't want to be colorblind, and you want to understand the background of each individual and where they come from. But what we don't want to do is get rid of the universal principles. Right? The gospel is built off of universal principles. We assimilate, regardless of our skin color, regardless of our backgrounds, into a Zion people under universal spiritual gospel principles. That doesn't mean we're not different. We want the differences because we want to reach across. We want to help each other out. That is part of the joy of creating a Zion people. So we want the differences, but we want to assimilate under universal principles that are righteous, as long as they're righteous, as long as they're gospel principles. Now, a little further down in the article, as he goes through this bizarre confessional, it's kind of like he read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, where she kind of does the same thing. She's kind of this confessional of her own racism. And then he goes into this, what always happens here, which is ridiculous. And I have to try and fight from the left and the right on this all the time. Get it out of party politics. I know that's where it's going to go. I understand that. But once you start attacking the opposite party that you're in, you've lost me. and you lose a lot of people. Right? That's not what this is about. This is an ideology. It happens to come from the far left. Right? It happens to come from the far left. But that's what he does. He goes in and talks about his mea culpa on being a strong conservative and part of the GOP, and it's like, okay, fine. You know, I don't care what your party politics are. It doesn't matter to me. I know a lot of people that are traditionally on the left, classical liberals, that can't stand CRT. They can't stand identity politics and what it's doing to the United States. This has nothing to do with being a liberal, as in terms of on the left, or being a conservative. That's what the TV media wants you to believe. And therefore, that's how the politics react, the politicians react. I saw a Republican senator grandstanding. It was ridiculous on CRT. You have to understand what the tenets of this ideology are and what they're doing. These guys are just using it for political purposes. Then he goes down here in part of this confessional and talks about going to law school. And here's what he says. He says, as he sees the certain court cases and how they went against those of African American descent and how it played out, all true. This is all true, right? He says, this was a struggle for me at first. I always thought I was not a racist person. This is key to understanding. And I considered the idea of systemic racism to be just an enforced guilt trip for white people. Okay, I'd like to see where he's looking. All of these cases he brings up are from the 1943, 1944, 1927, 1923, 1922, 1875. It's like, okay, show me the systemic racism today. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's almost gone. It's almost gone. And certainly a massive improvement on where we've been in the past. Right? And better than probably just about any other country in the world, despite the fact that we're a melting pot. Anyway, I considered the idea of systemic racism to be an enforced guilt trip for white people. But as I studied law at BYU and saw the course that this country's legal history ran over the centuries, it became apparent to me that we got started off on the wrong foot. We did. That's true. And built on that bad foundation and wove very racist ideas into the very fabric of the United States. This is partially true. It's not all true. Right? Again, he's going to an extreme on this. He goes on to say, in recent weeks, Utah politicians acted with amazing rapidity in responding to the emergency of needing to ban critical race theory from being taught to Utah school children. Okay, first of all, I interviewed Steve Christensen, who is the state congressman who sponsored that bill. I know exactly what's in there. I've read it. They don't ban critical race theory, right? They ban racism. That's all that's in there. There are three very universal principles saying you can't say that one group is more superior than the other. That's pretty much what it breaks down to. There's no banning of some abstract idea of what critical race theory is. And then we get to the most disturbing part of all of this. And, you know, again, I hope this is unintended. I have my doubts, but I hope that this is unintended. He says, it is undeniable. This is where we get to the church. It is undeniable that in this modern era, we have been reminded again and again that racism among disciples of Jesus Christ is untenable. Yes, we have. What does that have to do with critical race theory? We've been reminded many times that we need to take care of the poor. And we still don't do the best job of that. We do a pretty good job of that. I've been involved in those types of things. I know we do a pretty good job of that. And we don't do it through any type of a Marxist solution. There's no critical theory in our humanitarian efforts or in our bishop's storehouse. Right? The answer to these issues is the gospel. Critical race theory is a perversion of the gospel. What he is doing is, if you saw what the professor at BYU did, the one where I brought up his lecture and showed his lecture, some of his lecture, he's conflating what the prophets say with critical race theory. It's very, very disturbing, and we're going to get more and more and more of this coming down the pike, and we've got to know how to fight it off, because we're going to lose people from this. We will lose people from this. What this guy's doing is the same thing that BYU professor did, which is conflate the words of the prophets with critical race theory. And it's very concerning that somebody reads this article and then all of a sudden says, oh, critical race theory is what the prophets are asking us to do. They're asking us to work through a Marxist-rooted ideology and movement. That's what he's saying. He continues and says, so Latter-day Saints whose own scriptures reference the inspiration at this country's founding have naturally approached the topic with some skepticism. Let me read that again, because here he gets into something very interesting. So Latter-day Saints whose own scriptures, that's in the Doctrine and Covenants, reference the inspiration at this country's founding, right? It's talking about the U.S. Constitution, have naturally approached the topic with some skepticism. Well, I wonder why. Surely critical race theory cannot possibly be in harmony with the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? Well, can it? He asks. Of course, that for him is rhetorical. And then he goes on to say this as if to answer that question. What do church leaders say? He says, whatever positions have been taught by leaders or widely accepted by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in years or decades past, it is undeniable that in this modern era we have been reminded again and again that racism among disciples of Jesus Christ is untenable. That's exactly right. It is. Speaking to members of the priesthood in 2006, President Gordon B. Hinckley lamented the ongoing racial strife, acknowledging that even right here among us there is some of this. I cannot understand how it can be. Now I am told that racial slurs and denigrating remarks are sometimes heard among us. Well, CRT goes well beyond that. But again, he's conflating the remarks here of problems of racism with, well, we better get on the CRT bandwagon here, onto the train here. And then President Hinckley says, as he's quoting him, we must make an effort to accommodate diversity. Agreed, we do. We need to accommodate, not force it. We don't force those things. We need to accommodate diversity. We need to support it. Let us all recognize that each of us is a son or daughter of our Father in heaven who loves all of his children. And this is the crucial thing that you're going to see. Whenever you see the prophets talking about race, they're going to bring that up in almost every case, because it's not the identity of your heritage. It's not the identity of your skin color, of your race, of your ethnicity that matters the most. They always put this in here because it is the assimilating identity for all of us. We are all children of God. And if we all focus on that and not on race, right, then there's less conflict between us. But of course, CRT is going to do the exact opposite. It's going to break everybody out into their intersectional groups and pit us all against each other in a massive power struggle. That's what it does. And then he goes on to the recent remarks of President Russell M. Nelson and President Dallin H. Oaks. And of course, he's going to cherry pick this. So let me help you with this a little bit and parse this out. He says, He quotes President Nelson in October 2020 conference, where he says, "Today, I call upon our members everywhere to lead out in abandoning attitudes and actions of prejudice." Critical race theory is the opposite of that, by the way. "I plead with you to promote respect for all of God's children." There's your identity. President Nelson goes on, "God does not love one race more than another." Well, intersectionality is going to teach you something different about the promotion of different races and identities than what is being said here by President Nelson. His doctrine, being God's doctrine on this matter, is clear. He invites all to come unto him. Again, where are we going? We're all going to the same place. We are all assimilating under the principles of the gospel, not pulled apart into intersectional groups. This is also the opposite of what Ibram Kendi teaches, right? He basically says that assimilating in any regard is a form of racism. What he's really saying is assimilating into a liberal democracy. That's what he's fighting against. Read his words carefully if you ever read Ibram Kendi. Assimilation, he calls it assimilating into white, but when he's really talking into a white culture, but what he's really saying is assimilating into a Western liberal democracy. Now, President Nelson goes on here and says, "I assure you that your standing before God is not determined by the color of your skin." Well, is that being colorblind? That's what I would ask the author here. He goes on with the words of President Nelson, "Are you willing to let God prevail in your life?" Remember, this is where he's talking about Israel and the one of the interpretations of what the name Israel means, which is let God prevail. Well, this is all about gathering Israel. This is exactly against what the author here of this article is saying. Because this whole talk where he inserts racism right in the middle of the talk, President Nelson is talking about gathering everybody together as one people, assimilating under certain values, certain gospel principles, one heart and one mind. Good luck with trying to teach that to a critical race theorist. And then he gets to President Oaks, and here's where we get some real cherry picking on his message and on President Oaks' message. His message is exactly the opposite of what this author is saying. I've been through that talk several times. It's a devotional that was given at BYU, I think late last year. It says, he quotes President Oaks where he says, "Ours is the duty to unite," again, the opposite of CRT, "and improve the future we will share in this country." Of course, what he leaves out from President Oaks' devotional in his talk is exactly how President Oaks thinks that we need to think about these things such as racism and the ideas of racial issues that we've had in the United States. He doesn't talk at all about how President Oaks says that we need clear thinking. And if you read his devotional, I'll link this in on the YouTube episode here. You will see how he approaches this. It is the exact opposite of what the author does here in this article. There is no clear thinking here based on what President Oaks says about clear thinking. President Oaks says, "You will recall President Russell M. Nelson's great teachings in General Conference on this subject, and perhaps my own plea that Latter-day Saints unite to root out racism." And then he says this, "To do that, we must have clear thinking. It's not a free-for-all of emotion and empathy without reason and thought, and really without charity to some degree, right? To do that, we must have clear thinking about how current events should be analyzed and acted upon in view of this nation's shameful history of black slavery. Be careful how you analyze this. For example, he says, I cannot condone our now erasing all mention and honor of prominent leaders such as George Washington and others who established our nation and gave us our Constitution because they lived at a time with legal approvals and traditions that condoned slavery. That's one example. And then he brings up Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter is the perfect example of how CRT works and how you can show a pretty package on the outside, but underneath there's a lot of pernicious ideology. And I'm not talking about the idea of even the marches with Black Lives Matter. I'm talking about the organization and what it represents as compared to the idea of supporting our African American brothers and sisters. There's a big difference. That is what President Oaks is talking about when he says clear thinking. Here's what he says specifically about Black Lives Matter. And I would say the exact same thing goes with critical race theory, which Black Lives Matter follows. He says, the shocking police-produced death of George Floyd in Minnesota last May was surely the trigger for these nationwide protests whose momentum was carried forward under the message of Black Lives Matter. Think of why he is bringing this up. This is a lightning rod concept to bring up, or idea to bring up here. But he's doing it because we need to learn to have clear thinking. Of course, Black Lives Matter, he says, right? Parse it out. Separate this. Of course, Black Lives Matter. Of course, there's been oppression of African Americans and other people of color. Of course, there has been. We need better solutions. We need to work harder at it. That is an eternal truth that Black Lives Matter, he says. All reasonable people should support. Unfortunately, that persuasive banner was sometimes used or understood to stand for other things that do not command universal support. Things like what? Well, like critical race theory and all critical theory that demeans the family, for example. Critical race theory is built to demean the family, to break it down. That is part of its movement. Or Marxist Roots, or getting rid of liberal democracy. So I think that's a crucial point to see here about this clear thinking. I'm going to use that term more and more that President Oaks used. We need clear thinking when seeing things like this article here. We need to be able to parse this out. Then we get this gem here, where he under the title of this section of his article, he calls it Trying to Be Like Jesus. So Jesus apparently was a critical race theorist and supported Marxist tenets. But here's what he says. When we consider whether CRT is compatible with the restored gospel or its merits generally, we must look at an actual definition of CRT as promulgated by its leading scholars and not just how some popular contemporary figures are using CRT. Okay, I agree somewhat to that. So I would bring up my Russia example here again, right, when he says this. Now, yes, there was a lot in the Communist Manifesto, in Das Kapital, and Engels' writings that were pretty horrific, actually, in terms of authoritarianism, in terms of the family, breaking the family down. And that's what radical feminism went into. They followed Engels quite a bit because he focused a lot more on breaking down the family unit, getting rid of it. And that's where CRT really comes from, actually. A big part of it is from the side of radical feminism. And by the way, I'll use the same author that the article's author here is using for supporting what CRT is here. So he wants to go through the four main points that Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic kind of support in their book called Critical Race Theory, which is one of the most mild books, actually, that I've read of those that are pushing critical race theory. Still got some doozies in there, but it's one of the more mild books, and it's meant to be that way. It's more meant to be an intermediate level reading. But here's what he puts in here. Racism is ordinary and not aberrational. So that's the first thing that Delgado and Stefancic are putting out as the first tenet of critical race theory. To some degree, there's a little bit of truth there, right? Is is that we've seen that ordinarily in the past. What they try to do is that it is in everything. So more contemporary writers you're going to see and speakers are going to see that is, they take it to an extreme. It's found everywhere. He even says this. This is the author of the article. He says, even for those who seek to not hold racist attitudes, like many Latter-day Saints, it's clear that there is little incentive to eradicate racism. We're all guilty of racism. He's going right along with, it sounds to me like he's converted to this. Critical race theorists would basically say that this means you're a racist because you have no incentive to eradicate the racism. Therefore, you are a racist. And that's very important to note based on what the author is going to say here in a minute. Now, how does this manifest again? And when we use racism as not an aberration, but in a normal, natural sense of how we carry our lives every day. Well, here's Robin DiAngelo, maybe the most famous writer right now that is a critical race theorist. She says, the question is not, did racism take place? But how did racism manifest in that situation? To them, it must exist everywhere all the time. And that's what is meant by critical theory. You're going to analyze the situation in a critical manner, capital C. And in this case, it's for race. You're going to break it down to race. Second, our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. Look, there's white privilege. There is white privilege. I would say that. I would use the word more white comfort. And what I mean by that is it's sometimes tough for someone who's white in a dominantly white country to step outside of their comfort zone. And I'm willing to go there and say that. I think that's where charity comes in. You've got to have charity and fill that gap. And that to me is the words of the prophets. We've got to root out racism. We have to support our African American and other people of color brothers and sisters, members of the church or not. We need more outreach. That's building a Zion people. That is gathering Israel. That doesn't mean you're doing it out of guilt. That doesn't mean you're doing it out because you owe it. It means because you love them. It is very different. Love means struggle. Love means bearing each other's burdens. That's what we do when we are baptized. We take on the name of Christ, and that name means condescension. That name means bearing burdens of others. That's what Christ did in Gethsemane and on the cross. But when we look for racism everywhere, right, it means that you're going to look for it until you find it. That is what CRT does. You look for it until you find it. That becomes the top of your hierarchy for analysis. Again, very different from the civil rights movement. This is not Martin Luther King. A little bit more from Özlem Sensoy and Robin DiAngelo of White Fragility in their critical theory educational manual called Is Everyone Really Equal? Here's what they say about critical race theory and about critical movements as a whole. Critical movements, capital C, initially advocated for a type of liberal humanism, individualism, freedom, and peace, but quickly turned to a rejection of liberal humanism. The ideal of individual autonomy that underlies liberal humanism, the idea that people are free to make independent, rational decisions that determine their own fate, was viewed as a mechanism for keeping the marginalized in their place by obscuring larger structural systems of inequality. There's our systems, or systemic. In other words, it fooled people into believing that they had more freedom and choice than societal structures actually allow. Systemic, when you hear systemic racism or anything else, systemic homophobia or systemic anything, the reason that is there is twofold. On one side of the coin, they're trying to say, oh, it's not you necessarily. But then they'll come in the other door and say, yes, you're white, you're racist, no matter what. Systemic cannot be separated from an individual. It just can't. It never is. That's the way it's always played out. That's the way all of the curriculum and the K-12 stuff for CRT plays out. It's just the way it is. The second side of the coin on that is systemic means liberal democracy. That is code for liberal democracy, for capitalism. See, when they say that it's in the systems, what they're saying is we have to change, uproot, radically alter the systems of the United States and of Western culture. And what do you think they're going to replace it with? That's why they go into systemic. That's the purpose of it. All right, he goes into the third and fourth. I'm not reasons that Delgado and Stefanczyk talk about. I'm not going to really go into these much. The third is social construction thesis, holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations. There's a lot of truth to this. And the fourth one is there is the notion of a unique voice of color. Sure, there is a unique voice of color. But again, he's cherry picking what he's putting in here. Not just from the authors here, but from the prophets. And then he quotes President Nelson again here as we come to a close on this episode in his in speaking with the NAACP in 2020 last year, where President Nelson said the wheels of justice should move fairly for all. Yes, that's a universal principle. That's liberal democracy. That is not what critical race theory believes in. And there's a plethora of writing about that, very specific. President Nelson goes on and says, Jesus of Nazareth came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Yes, this is the most abundant nation that has ever existed and civilization in the West that has ever existed. It has not been on a level playing field for all. We have to close those gaps. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In his conclusion, the article's author says, if members of the church are threatened by CRT, it is not because it teaches us to hate America, as some suppose. Yes, it does. You're talking about a very small portion of it that might be used for analysis sometimes in some industries that does not carry the body of what CRT really is. You've heard me say just a few things about what it is, written by their own authors. He says it exposes uncomfortable truths about our nation, our society, and yes, even about our individual selves. Well, I would agree with that to some degree. I think it does bring awareness. I will give it that. It has brought awareness. And then he contradicts pretty much the entire article that he's written so far and says CRT doesn't mean you have to feel bad about yourself. It doesn't mean you are a racist. It does mean you are a racist. And he just went through a total confessional of how he had racist attitudes. And you've seen the authors of CRT that write all the time that you are a racist, if you're white especially. That is a big part of how CRT plays out. He says it doesn't mean Caucasians must all feel white guilt. Yeah, that's what they teach. It is a way of rethinking about the past so we can move into the future. There's some truth to that part right there. There's some truth to that. He ends with saying, we also need not fear CRT, as we have seen that it demands nothing of us that is opposed to our religious principles. That is, I'm not going to say that's a lie. Again, I have to assume the best here and think that he doesn't know what he's talking about, that he hasn't read the materials, that he really hasn't read all the papers and the authors and the speeches by these individuals. It is antithetical to the principles of the gospel. And my concern is exactly this. I told you that this is what was going to be happening, and it's not first of all, it's easy to see once you understand that this is an ideology. It's a religion. It's a religion that opposes the gospel, and you eventually have to pick one or the other. You can't live with one foot in each. It won't work, right? It's too ideological and too opposed to the gospel. We need better solutions that are not CRT, that are not coming from critical theory. But this is the concern. And you're going to see this again at church. It's going to come up more and more often. I hope that you can stand up to it. What I'm trying to do here with this series and this podcast is give you more information and an understanding of how to deal with this and to see it for what it really is. Remember, this reminds me of the story of the snake, right? You're at the top of the hill. You pick up the rattlesnake that says, I'm not going to bite you. Don't worry about it. And you carry it down and you get to the bottom and the rattlesnake bites you. And you say, well, why did you do that? You said you weren't going to do that. And the snake says, you knew what I was when you picked me up. Right? We know what this is. If you're going to pick it up, you're going to get bitten. And yet, if we hear this over and over again, within the church, more and more people are going to believe it without having enough of an understanding and having studied what this really is, what's really packed behind it. Lenin, I've been studying a lot about Lenin's early life recently, and one of the things he said was, a lie told often enough becomes the truth. And that's my concern here. If we hear this over and over again, you're going to start to believe it. And you're going to think that it's coming from a good place. This does not come from a good place. Remember the whole parable about a corrupt tree cannot produce a good fruit, right? It's going to produce a corrupt fruit. Marxism is corrupt. And as much as it has evolved to end up with critical theory, critical legal studies, critical race theory, it's still the same thing. It still has the same objectives. It is an ideology. It is a worldview that is very different from the gospel. I hope that helps. Thanks for listening.